This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name's Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor in psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hey guys, I'm Austin Manchadi, and I'm a research assistant on this project.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Giles. I'm a student at UQ Psychology.
And what we're doing today is we're recording introductory videos for all of the chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And today we are on chapter 28, Gender and Environmental Movements. The authors of the chapter are Chie Togami and Suzanne Stagenborg. And Togami is a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and Stagenborg is a professor in sociology at the same university. So I guess the way that the chapter is structured, it talks about how gender affects men and women's participation and recruitment, and then the ideologies and frames of the movement, and then the tactics that the participants in environmental movements choose. And so it starts off with an important, but in some ways an obvious point that historically there's been a lot of barriers to women's participation on equal terms to men, Austin?
Yeah, definitely. Like in the 20th century, men primarily dominated environmental movements, or EMOs for short, and women tended to go towards community organizations. Men have dominated sort of the big green mainstream organizations and more so the radical ones. And because of that, these movements, they're often framed as quite masculine or macho. I think even one of them referred to themselves as like the cowboys or something, some very male term. And because of this, the machoism of the sexism, there's a higher risk that it could deter women from joining some of the bigger or the more radical ones. And if you compare that to fighting contamination of schools and communities by pollution and toxic waste, women seem to be more drawn to that, particularly through a maternal perspective.
Yeah, just to jump in there. So even before the radical groups formed in the 70s, there was kind of that long 20th century period of conservation and preservation. And some organizations just simply didn't admit women. There was also a theme that at the time, women were not meant to be in the public sphere. So if they were admitted, they certainly wouldn't take up those leadership roles. And finally, there was an association of some of those early environmental movements with conservation and preservation agendas around hunting and kind of keeping the big game movement. So the idea there is that only men would engage in this sport, if we call it a sport, of hunting animals. And so they were the ones that were associated with that early movement. But then there was a change in the 60s and 70s. Mackenzie, do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so the women came, they were more facilitated. They, in the chapter, they talk about how women often in family roles would be exposed to environmental concerns through their children. So by caring through their children, they would become, particularly with toxic waste, they would become aware of the problems of environmental concerns there. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes.
Yeah, that's okay. So just to jump in, so in the 60s and 70s, this was really when the regulations started to develop against pollution. But before then, toxic chemicals like DDT were being sprayed on food. And you would see poisons literally being dumped from factories into the water system, and then people would drink it. And so what happened was children would get sick. And so although women were not supposed to be in the public sphere, they're supposed to defend their children, right? So at that point, women would jump into a lot of what were called at the time community health organizations. And they often played, a role as founders and as leaders of those organizations.
Yeah, I think also women considered caring for the environment as, I think they called it municipal housekeeping.
You mean municipal housekeeping?
Yeah,
that's right. It's almost like tidying up the city.
Yeah. So yeah, they would kind of extend their mother roles for their children onto the environment. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was too. And the other thing that I thought was really fun in this historical review was talking about something that I've never thought about, which is the association between women's hats and conservation. Because in the 50s and 60s, I gather that women often wore hats with feathers. And actually, this was so intense, this fashion, that it was threatening bird species and pushing them to the brink of extinction. So even before the community health themes developed, in the early part of the 20th century in the United States, there was kind of one area that women conservationists were allowed to mobilize for culturally, and that was dealing with themes around women's hats and feathers. So I thought that was interesting. In the next section of the chapter, the authors talk about how in the 80s, the divide between, men and women's environmental organizations softened. There had always been, of course, men and women in both streams of the environmental movement, but there was a growing awareness of environmental racism where toxic waste dumps were situated totally disproportionately in communities of color and poor communities. So it's not only a problem that we're poisoning our neighborhoods, it's also we disproportionately don't do that in the areas where the rich people live and where the white people live. So there was a lot of leadership that was provided by women of color in the environmental racism movement in the 80s in the United States, and that provided a kind of connection between community health, which is always an environmental issue, but with which mainstream groups had refused to look at, and the mainstream environmental movement. And at that point as well, because of the rise of feminism, men started to let women into the organizations that women had been excluded from, and also to consider that it was okay to have women leaders at times. And so that was a kind of change that leads into the next section, which is when we talk about the gendering and the relationship between gender and ideologies. So there was also another ideology that had supported women's involvement, like Mackenzie talked about with kids, and that was maternalism. Can you tell us about that, Austin?
Yeah, so movements in the past have sought to gain respect through maternalism, given it's a very important part of who we are. And it says, women have this sort of special purchase on morality, which makes them especially well suited to lead interventions and political affairs. Like traditionally, obviously, women have been seen as more emotional and men have been seen as much, I don't want to say robotic, but essentially, things like toxic masculinity push that ideology. But being able to have those people skills is really important, so it plays up the biological differences between men and women, as women are definitely more susceptible to impacts of pollution and health problems related to childbearing, like birth defects or even miscarriage. However, a common critique is women are often portrayed as victims or saviors, these two very polarized things. And it kind of creates this paradox, which is troubling, particularly around getting women involved, because it just, the different perceptions lead to different views, which then leads to different decisions, and it creates a sort of chain effect that just makes it hard.
Yeah, and it's like if you're kind of really sensitive and vulnerable and caring, you can be portrayed as this disempowered victim who can't act.
Yeah.
But then, like, if you're this wise mother figure who's able to like bring, the like power of motherhood to bear, it's like people have unrealistic expectations. That's what the authors say about what they should be able to do. And even to the point that women and mothers can sometimes be stigmatized for failing to protect their families from toxic waste, as if like motherhood alone would give them that power in the face of corporations doing the wrong thing and governments that aren't regulating. So that was a sobering reflection. There was another ideology coming out of the 70s that also brought women more into the movement, right? Like, tell us about ecofeminism, Mackenzie.
So ecofeminism kind of talks about how there are parallels between women, like the subjugation of women and like the destruction of the natural world, I think is what they mentioned in the chapter.
Yeah.
And it kind of talks about how we must like turn away from kind of domination and this approach from patriarchy towards like centering the earth, really, and kind of, I think, in hand also women as well.
Yeah. And there was this kind of ideology or this kind of vision that some of modern society that's framed as very male is like this idea that we're somehow rational and we can be like Austin said, like robots that are interacting with the world. Somehow we're a part of it. But in ecofeminism, it's highlighting that actually we are all connected. We are all in one ecosystem, and life is pretty sacred and important. So the idea there is that those are somehow associated with hearing the voices of women. When we hear women's voices, we're going to understand that wisdom, and that a lot of the logic of the past, this idea of domination, is come from this like stereotypically male philosophy. And that kind of ties into the climate theme as well, because like building on from environmental racism, there was a discussion of climate justice. And so with climate justice, it connected in with Indigenous peoples all around the world and the global South. And many of those communities, as Austin and I have been learning in other chapters, have never lost, either for men or women, the central perception and valuing of the interconnection of everything and how humans are part of the natural world. And so this push to listen to those voices, including Indigenous women and people from around the world, has come back in the framing of the climate justice movement and connected everyone together again, allowing them to work together. And then the last part of the chapter is a discussion of tactics, although that also comes in throughout the whole chapter. And this is, by tactics, this refers to the choices that people make about how to pursue the goals as a movement. And so, for example, should we have letter writing or rallies? Should we have bake sales or direct action? And so a lot of those behaviors are actually really gendered, as the authors point out. So in the 1960s and 70s, when the community health movements formed against toxic waste and pollution, they often drew on like women's tactics and women's networks with great success. And there's this famous organization in the 70s called GASP. It was Group Against Smog and Pollution. It was a community health organization formed and led by women. And they were able to mobilize like women's groups and church groups and women's networks and have this huge bake sale fundraising event that thousands of women from 42 organizations participated in. And so that kind of mobilization of women's behavior was quite different from traditional ways of advocating and lobbying in the male-dominated mainstream groups. And then, as we talked about with the radical tactics, some of them have historically chosen to portray themselves in quite sexist and machismo ways, and that's been off-putting to women. Although there are other women that have always engaged in direct action, and there's this story about one of the women climate activists who is trying to stop the destruction of redwood forests in the US, these beautiful big trees. And she took direct action by staying in the tree for like over a year. I think it was over 700 days. So trying to stop that tree from being cut down. So I think that's kind of an interesting part of the chapter, and just reminding us that not everyone has access to these repertoires of direct action and public protest equally. Like when we talked about consumerism in another chapter and how you can use your money to buy eco-friendly products, the reality is like men and women might have different levels of wealth, or different racial and cultural and classes have different levels of wealth. And then when we look at who feels safe to be arrested, one of the authors for that chapter was talking about how not everyone feels safe to be arrested, especially in communities of color and women that might have their children taken off them. So thinking about that is really interesting. I guess I found it great to read this chapter. Austin and I are nearly at the end of the recording. This is the second last of the 38 recordings that we're doing. And it is striking how much issues of gender affected the way the movement developed, and how much these other prejudices can, continue to play a role. And I'm always grateful to learn about the history. And I certainly had no idea about a lot of this, including, from the lighthearted to the serious, like the stories of the feathers, which actually turned out to be really terrible. Feathers in women's hats, who knew? What about you, Austin? What was your kind of takeaway from the chapter?
I think it's somewhat similar to yours. It's this chapter is, along with the other ones, done a really good job at illuminating these things of like how interconnected all these things are. A lot of people see environmental problems. Oh, it's just fossil fuels, whatever. But what caused the fossil fuels, and what caused that, and it shows that this is really long sort of chain. Starts with just problems in societies, kind of just led to this problem within the world.
Yeah,
something needs to change if we want to survive the next 100, 200 years.
Yeah, that's right. Let alone 50,000 years as a species. So we can't we can't keep ignoring this crazy interconnections. Mackenzie, what were your thoughts or final reflections or questions?
Yeah, I think my final thought about all of it was how like pre-existing ties and like those gender identities can either like facilitate or impinge how active someone is with environmental concerns and
Yeah.
how they approach them as well.
Yeah. It's something that you were talking about before. It's really changed across the different generations. Like someone like Greta Thunberg being a leader of the movement and inspiring millions to act, that could never have happened in the 20th century because not just of her gender, but also her age, right? And how young people have been marginalized and excluded and their voices haven't been heard. But tools like social media have really changed things. And then you were reflecting on the changing valuing of work and family. Mackenzie, do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting because from what I gather from the chapter, one of the main like factors as to why women were becoming more involved in environmental activism was through their children. But I know that a lot of women these days they actively don't want children. So it's interesting how those gender roles may have like changed through time and how that could apply to current times when it comes to environmental activism.
Yeah, and even some women deliberately choose not to have children for environmental reasons, which is just such a different relationship to the whole motherhood concept that was important in the 60s and continues to be for many women now. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Well, maybe I'll close there and I'll say thank you to you, Austin, for being part of the recording. And thank you to you, Mackenzie, for being part of the recording. For all of us as psychologists, it's a bit outside our normal purview. It's not the normal way that we experience science and research. And it's been really great to see everyone moving outside their comfort zone and learning a lot. I put my hand up for that. That's what I've done. Anyways, so bye to everyone and thanks for watching. Bye now.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.